It's wonderful to be back here with you all in person, with the old friends, meet new ones. So I'd like to share with you a few thoughts about how I see the domestic politics of authoritarian rule in China shaping its global ambitions and its policy preferences, which are, of course, only one input into the future of the international order, but may have a significant role. So there's an increasingly prevalent view in Washington and maybe perhaps here in the UK as well. The United States and China are in the foothills of a new Cold War, or at least some kind of extreme competition to quote unquote win the 21st century. And in this, I would say, increasingly prevailing view, China is a revisionist that seeks to become the world's predominant power and undermine the so-called rules-based international order. Of course, prior to this, I was much more optimistic that China could be peacefully integrated into the international system, seeing China as a stakeholder, a responsible stakeholder. And then the view of, which I would say was quite prominent, the engagement, decades of engagement work. They're considered counterfactual. There has been no major war in East Asia in decades. And if you imagine the alternative history, had the United States not normalized relations with China or brought China into the international system, the world might have been considerably more dangerous, with China on the outside spoiling for a fight earlier in time. And kind of a subsidiary of this view is that actually China, far from undermining the system by spoiling it, was actually too much going along and free riding on the system. But in recent years, I would say we've seen much more variation than any of these bumper stickers really can capture. In some cases, China has indeed sought to reform or reshape the system from within. In some cases, to, for example, increase voting shares in the IMF, while other cases trying to advance its interests outside of established institutions, creating new ones such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And in some cases, it has at least sought to style itself as a conservative defender of the UN Charter and the norm of sovereignty, although, of course, there are ways in which China has not been fully faithful to those principles, including providing diplomatic cover for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and, of course, rejecting the standing of the International Tribunal in the Law of the Sea, and this when it invalidated China's claims to the South China Sea. And then I would say in one important area of global governance, climate change, we have seen over a period of years a pretty striking shift in China's approach from obstructionism at Copenhagen to more constructive leadership at Paris, and then some mix. And I would say, in the last couple of years, whereas China had been previously content to sort of free ride on U.S. leadership, now increasingly rhetorically and in terms of its initiatives, increasingly trying to discredit American leadership of the international system and promote itself as the defender, so-called defender of multilateralism. So explaining this variation both across space as well as over time is really the purpose of this project. And I would say an important article, Ian Johnston laid out some of this variation, where both China and the United States support some aspects of the international order, disaggregated it, but in other cases opposing other elements. And importantly, this view doesn't really capture the evolution over a time and stops short of trying to provide an explanation for this variation. And so in many cases, I think a key insight from his piece is that it doesn't make sense to talk of a stable status quo that the United States is defending and China is seeking to overturn. There's far greater variation. But where exactly this variation came from and where is it going? I think that those are some key questions that this project seeks to begin to illuminate. And I would say that in the same time, since I began this project, the set of issues on which both the United States and China support up here in the upper left-hand quadrant have over time dwindled in terms of the as issues where China has supported, the United States has come out in opposition. Areas where the United States supports, China has come out in opposition or simply have declined to participate. And so even though nominally the United States and China both ostensibly still support, the WTO or others like G20, I hope to see them both attending and maybe meeting on the sidelines next week. Nonetheless, the bulk of effort, I would say, is still spent now on institutions outside of or these sort of fit for purpose coalitions, certainly at least on the US side, although still, we do see evidence of both of them investing in various ways in the overarching inclusive. So beneath the rhetoric of China's sort of true multilateralism, she has encouraged Chinese diplomats to be more active in quote unquote leading the reform of global governance, including reshaping norms, as Professor Foote has suggested and showed in her work, toward privileging state sovereignty over the rights of individuals in the political domain. But nonetheless, I think it's important to look at the range of these approaches in the international system, in part because I think disaggregating these preferences, or at least determining on what issues is China most likely to insist on its preferences and where might it be more flexible, will be a necessary step in determining whether and what issues and how the United States and China might be able to achieve some kind of modus vivendi or competitive coexistence in the multilateral space. And so the project seeks to look at how domestic politics or domestic political imperatives CCP holds affects China's foreign policy preferences across issue areas, as well as how in turn international politics and the international environment influences the domestic landscape in China. But the starting premise here really is the Chinese Communist Party has sought, first and foremost, regime security. It's one of the few nominally communist regimes to remain, and it's been definitely afraid of going the way of the Soviet Union in the sphere of quote-unquote peaceful evolution. And I've argued that two characteristics, centrality and heterogeneity, or centrality and contestation, shape the domestic politics of a given issue area. Since the late 1970s, the Chinese Communist Party has really relied on a mix of, I would say to differing degrees, the central pillars of nationalism, economic performance, and public security or stability to justify its rule. Sometimes this is referred to as sovereignty, security, and development, and I'm the project. And it's on issues that are linked to these central pillars on Hong Kong, maritime disputes, that China has been much more active, hyperactive, in making demands and systematic preference, even when this is led to be quite the object of international censure and condemnation. But on other issues that have been less centrally linked to these pillars of regime security and stability, the Chinese government has been a bit more flexible. Many issues before the United Nations, for example, on peacekeeping or non-proliferation, under international pressure, the Chinese-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank adopted rhetoric about the environmental and social consequences of its policies that mirrored or in some ways matched those development banks. And the key prediction here is that the more central an issue is, or the more tightly linked it is to these central pillars, the harder it is for the Chinese government to make concessions without suffering some kind of domestic. And as a result, international pressure tends to be more likely to backfire, or at least put pressure on the government to be seen as tough in defending its core interests. And the more likely that the government is to act unilaterally in order to bolster these domestic. And in the spirit of a two-level game, the more central an issue is domestically, the more likely the government may have leverage, but the more likely it is that discussions of that issue internationally might fail to produce a deal because of its domestic constraint at home. Now, of course, whether or not this domestic centrality of an issue leads to greater conflict or cooperation in the international arena really depends on how other external stakeholders are situated and whether they are in turn willing to, in some ways, accommodate or make concessions given these domestic imperatives. I think it's important to note that these central pillars are not always working in unison. There are often trade-offs or tensions between trying to, on the one hand, pursue growth, on the other hand, pursue stability, as well as standing up these transnational interests and more in the security space. And so, for example, Taylor Frail has showed in his work that historically the Chinese Communist Party has been willing to make territorial compromises with neighboring states at moments when domestic unrest meant that China had a strategic interest in working with a neighboring country to help secure control over minority populations, particularly in the wake of the Great Leap Forward, as well as the Tiananmen unrest. China's changing stance on climate change is another example. where for a number of years, China regarded that issue or the efforts to limit carbon emissions as threatening China's economic growth and development, and it acted as a spoiler at Copenhagen. Fast forward a number of years when the scale of the public health and air pollution catastrophe in China became the subject of a lot of mass as well as elite outrage in China, the Chinese government started to shift strategy, investing much more in touting its efforts to limit carbon emissions and clean up business at home, with public health and stability really to the fore. And then finally, another example of this trade-off that the government faces between these different pillars is how they manage national polarization, the subject of my first book. Because this kind of grassroots nationalism can help the government showcase its resolve and demonstrate that China, it's hard for China to make concessions, but that also doing so comes at some risk or cost to domestic stability. And it's this domestic dilemma that in my first book I argued that the international context, the desire to show resolve, reassurance is helped adjudicate. Now, it's also important to recognize that China is not a monolith. I don't need to tell you that, but there are so many different sources of domestic contestation or heterogeneity. And I would say that this heterogeneity persists even despite the growing personalization under Xi Jinping, although it's harder and harder to discern. So you have certainly different geographic, economic, institutional, and even ideological. So, for example, Yan Shuitong has written that while Marxism is the official ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, it has had limited influence after now on China's actual foreign policy, and he points to the competing strands of liberalism as well as traditional Chinese values in competing for. And I don't think you can understand China's response to the initial outbreak of COVID-19 without referencing these domestic central-local divisions, where you had local officials on the eve of important political meetings hiding the true extent of human-to-human transmission from central-level officials who came to investigate. And by the time they understood, it was too late. And so what does this central-local, geographic, theological contestation mean? It means that there's oftentimes difficulty with implementation and enforcement when there's more and more domestic contestation. So, for example, on the issue of China's environmental commitments, you often have local officials resisting central directives to shut down polluting dams. Local officials have typically economic development be amongst the primary considerations in their internal promotion. And so the greater the contestation is domestically, the greater the effort the Chinese government has to go to in order to make side payments to accommodate differing interests, adopting policies that may benefit some, but having to pay off others. And so if these illustrations are representative, these two dimensions, centrality and contestation, don't always map neatly onto one another. Some highly central issues are also characterized by a high degree of contestation of winners and losers, but other issues are characterized by less contestation and less centrality. But in some cases, as Ian Johnston points out with the Iran nuclear deal, we still have sometimes the interests of, for example, welcoming a connected arms exporter, making it harder for China to implement proliferation agreements, even though it had played an important role in helping redesign a key nuclear reactor to reduce Iran's future plutonium output. It nevertheless had to sort of acquiesce or at least fail to halt the export of ballistic missile technology. So we have this kind of partial compliance or implementation. So far I've given you really a second image approach where domestic politics is China's policy in broad strokes. But I now want to layer on the other type of interaction where the international environment in turn feeds back into the domestic political landscape in China we might consider a second and first. And I think this is really critical for understanding the evolution of how issues are framed over time, how the government as well as other subnational actors interpret different issues to mobilize different people in order to meet the demands of the United States. environment. So, for example, the Chinese Communist Party framed the Hong Kong protests, the U.S.-China trade war, as an issue of a national struggle reminiscent of the Opium War, the Korean War, in order to demonstrate resolve audiences and to bolster popular support for bearing the costs of a protracted struggle or conflict. And so this is an effort to increase the centrality of an issue as well as diminish potential contestation or grievances about that policy. And oftentimes the government has, in fact, tolerated nationalist protests. From a prior era, as I documented in this book, the government has been very strategic about when to allow and when to repress nationalist mobilization. And although the work that I did for this book was, pertained to offline street protests, more recently this kind of mobilization that's taking place largely online, where the government has tolerated and sometimes encouraged efforts in social media and others forums to drown out and in some cases persecute those that would criticize government policy. But I think it's important to note that the government has not always chosen to mobilize opposition voices. At least in the past, it spent nearly equal effort trying to tamp down nationalist voices in order to preserve room, flexibility, and manage position. Repression is still an option. And I think it's interesting to note that so far, at least, there haven't been protests loud against violence. Other means have been largely used to date to signal that China's resolve on that issue. And so that I suspect will likely continue, but I don't think that means that policy in China is immune to nationalist pressure. And indeed, Xi Jinping's embrace of the language of struggle to dare to, in telling cadres to dare to struggle and be good at fighting has created a very frothy online environment. And it's made managing an issue like Taiwan even more fraught. As one Chinese official told me that their response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August was seen and criticized by me online in China as being insufficient. But you may ask, how does this online sentiment or even popular sentiment really matter if the government can simply manage or manipulate this public opinion? If it's all endogenous, how can the government really be feeling the weight of this pressure in its foreign policy? So to evaluate these questions, I and co-authors have turned to survey experiments to evaluate the extent to which the government can use its rhetoric and its propaganda powers to mitigate domestic backlash and secure popular support. And the bottom line is that our survey experiments suggest the government can, in fact, buy some wiggle room using bluster or other kinds of tough but vague talk, but still pays some cost for not taking tough action in the face of foreign provocations, both real and. And so while we found that the Chinese government does, in fact, pay what political scientists call audience costs for making explicit threats and then not following through, in actuality, these kinds of committing threats are relatively rare. More common is what we call bluster, tough but vague talk, which we have found helps bolster popular support for the Chinese government's foreign policy performance, even when it doesn't take action. So, for example, when tensions with Japan escalated in the East China Sea, China used fiery words and established an air defense identification zone, demanding that foreign aircraft identify themselves and comply with Chinese instructions. And so reminding Chinese citizens that the Chinese government established this ADIZ helped improve their evaluations of the government's performance, even though they were also told that in the end, China didn't actually do anything to prevent Japanese planes from flying through the area. But when we looked at Chinese public reactions to a variety of perceived provocations, both real and exaggerated, we found a decrease in popular approval of the Chinese government controlling or the outcome of the scenario. And so this has important implications. Yeah. So the implications of this is that conventional expectation is that leaders invoke public humiliations, foreign slights to rally the people of the flag. But my research suggests that these rally effects are conditional on the government taking various forms of tough action rather than something that they can move to reflexively. And so that means the Chinese government may be more limited in its ability to invoke these foreign provocations to build public support, like celebrating the EP3 pilot Wang Wei, who died in the collision in 2001 with the US reconnaissance plane. They can't celebrate these martyrs without also stoking pressure for action. We also looked at the effects of government propaganda in the context of resumption of US freedom of navigation in the South China Sea in 2015, looking at public reactions before, during, and after the United States restarted these patrols. And in the days following the patrols, we found an increase again in public disapproval of the government, which had issued some vague warnings but didn't actually do anything with force to intercede and crack the patrols. And so these kind of real-time results suggest that despite the Chinese government's bluster, and there was plenty of it, the Chinese government was unable to fully offset the costs of restraint in the face of foreign military actions. And so this, while it's true that the government has been able to some extent, reduce public demands for military actions with bluster and other symbolic displays, they may not fully succeed. And so what over the long term I expect is that US efforts or other foreign efforts to strengthen deterrence through these public presence operations may actually have the unwanted effect of stoking popular pressure in China. So to zoom out a bit, how do these sort of outside in, inside out dynamics contribute to the overall trajectory of Chinese foreign policy and US-China relations? In the short run, I think we have seen that the Chinese government is trying to thread the needle between projecting resolve, but also mitigating the short-term risks of unwanted escalation, as we saw in their response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But I think that over the long term, this growing tilt toward emphasizing resolve at the expense of reassurance, and doing so by largely allowing nationalists or more hardline voices to flourish, temporarily sometimes muffling them, or some people will get a slap on their wrist. But overall, I would say that the opinion climate in China has the more dovish and liberal voices have been more systematically repressed, and those that are on the more hawkish or nationalistic end tending to flourish. And that, I would say, has overall reduced the credibility of China's assurances, as well as the ambiguity and flexibility in foreign perceptions of China's. And so today, I think the United States and China are in a kind of action-reaction spiral that has created incentives on both sides of the Pacific to narrow the bounds of domestic debate, strengthening hawkish tendencies and the reflexive positioning of officials on both sides. Obviously, these are two very different political systems. There's far more space for domestic debate in a system like the United States than there is in China. But nonetheless, I see these, the rising tensions between the United States and China making it harder and harder to sustain that kind of action debate, especially. And so this kind of what you might call a security dilemma, which is taking place at the international level, is also having effects on the domestic dynamics inside of both of these. Some of the policy implications that follow from the framework, first on issues that are in China highly central and not particularly contested. I think we need to be particularly, as viewed from the outside, if you were trying to shape China's behavior, you have to be careful about pressure that may have the counterproductive effect of hardening long-term attitudes inside China. And there's some excellent work by Jamie Jones and look at the impact of US and other Western human rights pressure on China, actually galvanizing reduced concern inside China for those very concerns, women's rights. That said, I don't think it's impossible to shift Chinese behavior on these highly central load confiscation issues, harkening back to Abel's work on territorial disputes, but you really need to have a countervailing and equally central incentive in order to shift policy. There has to be a trade-off government is able to make rather than just pressure, unconditional pressure. And then, moving fully into the policy space, I started to think more and more about détente as a potential model for ways in which the United States and China, for example, consider coordinated steps to lower the temperature without necessarily requiring real compromise on these issues. It's just reducing the likelihood of these taking steps to come back from the brink while nonetheless still preparing to keep on these issues. If an issue is central but more contested domestically, which I would say characterize a number of issues in the past before the kind of national security imperative sort of enveloped everything and moved issues from high contestation to low contestation, I would say previously there were much more effective efforts that could play different constituencies off one another. For example, on the issue of Chinese exchange rates, multilateral pressure at one time helped accelerate renminbi appreciation, with the Chinese government having them to compensate some of these domestic losers with subsidies and other government policies. I would say overall that multilateral pressure needs to be more effective on these low centrality issues, but recognizing that most powerful domestic actors may nonetheless capture policy, there may be some issues with enforcement. It's also, I think, important when we consider the number of different audiences that the Chinese government has to play to, that we often understand rhetoric that comes out of China as playing to many different audiences, which oftentimes can explain kind of multi-vocal contradictory messaging inside even a single speech. So in conclusion, if you had to pick a single bumper sticker to describe the Chinese system, I would say disgruntled stakeholder probably describes China. Frankly, it also, I think, describes the United States and other countries that we might name. The Chinese Communist Party has certainly behaved strategically, investing in reshaping, rejecting international arrangements in issue areas where they are tightly tied to the government's domestic rules and centrality of these pillars, but being more willing to free ride or defer on areas that are more peripheral. And so if China is simultaneously a revisionist, a free rider, a reformer, and a defender of various aspects of the status quo, disgruntled stakeholder to me seems like a catch. I would say that taking seriously the different kinds of interests that underpin Chinese foreign policy means treating China's intentions as a moving target, not something that we can read off of some speech that Lincoln gave in 2013, where there might be a general direction that has been set out, but over time, the implementation of that, what that actually means in practice, is very much subject to the push and pull of, frankly, just reality, material realities that the Chinese Communist Party confronts, as well as what seems feasible given the environment. And so what I've argued is that, primarily China's international behavior reflects to some extent spillover effects of China's domestic investments. Sometimes those are positive, such as China's investments in renewable technologies, and sometimes those externalities are negative, such as China's investments in surveillance. And that we, rather than seeing everything through the lens of China's blueprint for global domination, it's important to look at what are the domestic interests that these investments serve, and then what are their consequences, of course, as those practices spill outside of borders. So what does this mean then for the future of the international order? As I said at the beginning, China's preferences first are evolving, but they're also only one input into this sort of strategic negotiation of the so-called rules-based international order. The United States and other powers have a great deal of agency too, as well as, of course, the vast majority of the world that live inside. And so I think really open questions remain around to what extent the United States, the United Kingdom, other powers redouble their commitments to working within an inclusive multilateral system, and to what extent they will use those efforts to thwart rather than tolerate China's appetite for growing global. I would say that on both sides of the Pacific, we are seeing an increased effort to thwart each other's efforts, reject each other's influence in international institutions. And I would say that at least in the US side, much of that American cynicism about the international order is bound up with the sense that international institutions like the WTO or WHO have benefited China at the expense of American interests. And this has, I think, contributed to undermining public confidence in these institutions, which, to some extent is jeopardizing the system's communication. And so I think the question for the United States and other democracies is how to balance allowing or tolerating enough influence for China inside that system without undermining American interests or other democratic countries' interests in defending and supporting it. Where is it that the United States and other democracies should seek to reinvest, and where can we live with to some extent? Of course, we are likely to see, I think, on these kind of central issues, human rights to internet governance, create heated contestation and even open confrontation with states on both sides pursuing unilateral efforts or plurilateral efforts through smaller groupings that fit for purpose and coalitions to drive forward progress on those issues. But to the extent that those efforts outside the inclusive international system are dwarf those that take place within the overarching systems, I think we were likely to see increasing the paralysis, if not stagnation, internationally. So I would say, absent some kind of grand bargain or concerted powers, the best case scenario for avoiding this kind of paralysis is a set of nested orders where you have kind of a more sovereigntist but encompassing order in the United Nations centered around the Westphalian notion of the heart of the charter. But then you also have these other smaller groupings ultimately trying to balance these centrifugal and centripetal forces. Now, ultimately, I think China's domestic social purpose doesn't require the destruction of the international order, but it certainly favors a much more conservative version that emphasizes these Westphalian norms of sovereignty and non-interference and primacy of the state for individual political rights. But there are, of course, also many instances where China is itself highlighting that sovereignty. So I think, although many may balk at the idea of moving toward a more Westphalian system, I might argue that the alternative could be So some have, I would say, looked at China's growing international influence and much more assertive, even aggressive efforts to secure China's so-called core interests and concluded that China is an existential threat to the United States and liberal democracy around the world. I would expect to make even more and more of that as we approach the 2024 presidential elections in the United States. And that's unfortunate because, in my view, that is an exaggeration. Certainly, I think the Chinese Communist Party seeks a world that is safe for autocracy, but I don't think that that is incompatible with a world safe for democracy if we take this Westphalian notion seriously. And so far, at least, China's efforts to secure space in the international system for autocracy have been more nationalistic than it has been universalistic, seeking to intimidate criticism of the CCP, but not necessarily requiring other countries to follow China's path. Although, of course, under Xi Jinping, you have seen more movement in this direction of proclaiming some lessons that others can learn from China's example. But still, as an alternative to the Washington consensus, a possible other path that could be followed. So in some ways, it's anti. But just because China is not bent on making other countries in its image, there's still many ways in which its authoritarian practices are diffusing, in some cases where China is directly helping in terms of the export of certain technology. And so some may say that we therefore need this head-on contest between autocracy and democracy. But in my view, this overstates the Chinese government's ideological appeal, and I worry that it could backfire, leading the Chinese Communist Party to conclude that it needs to, in fact, engage much more aggressively in this direction, tipping the balance of views domestically within China toward those who want a more evangelical notion of governance, rather than, as is currently the case, defending the right of other countries to pursue their own individual. So in the end, much of my work, particularly in the public space, has really affirmed that the best strategy for dealing with the more authoritarian and assertive China is to adopt an approach that lets democracies like the United States be the best version of themselves and driving forward a positive, some affirmative agenda, rather than reflexively seeking to counter whatever China is forward. The lodestar, as I wrote in years, for U.S. foreign policy ought to be the world that we seek, not the world. That I'll end and really welcome your comments.